Hello, my name is Adriana. I am a trained and nationally certified trauma therapist with a background in acute work, which is where I came to learn of Hope for HIE. And today I'd like to talk a little bit about trauma, coping, and making meaning. So before we start, I'd like to talk a little bit about the personal narratives that really shape our worlds, the things that we tell ourselves throughout the day, throughout our lives, that build the story of who we are and who we are in relation to other people. And in those personal narratives, the building blocks are really the words. And so today, as we're talking about trauma, I would like to be really mindful about the words that we're using in describing these events and experiences. Because for one person, an event can feel traumatic, and for another person, they might experience it more as a hardship or a challenge, and for someone else, it might not make much of an impact at all. And so I hope that today you can take what feels right for you and leave the rest. So what is trauma? Trauma as a concept has really moved beyond the battlefield. We used to think of trauma as perhaps engaging in combat or living through a civil war, these really uncommonly tragic events. But research and clinical practice have made it really, really clear that there are many types of traumas that can have a lot of different impacts on individuals. Some people like to think of it as big T or small t trauma. I really don't see much of a benefit in delineating and categorizing trauma, but for some people, it can be helpful to think of those really uncommon events and the ones that most of us are likely to encounter in our lives, like grief and death. So there are many definitions of trauma, just as there are many types of trauma, but the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has 3 E's that are helpful guideposts. And SAMHSA is the National Clearinghouse for Mental Health definition and cataloging of treatments. So these 3 E's are the event or events, the experience of that event or events, and the effect or effects of these events. So trauma can be either one single event, such as one frightening health episode, a death, a serious accident, or it can be a series of events, like an ongoing chronic illness or a national health crisis, if that rings any bells for anyone. It can be specific to an individual. It can be specific to a family system or a group or a society as a whole. And there are 2 types of events that I would like to focus on today that really feel a little bit relevant today, given all of the things that we're experiencing as a whole. The first is loss. And loss covers a wide variety of experiences. It ranges from physically losing someone or something to the perceived loss of someone or something. A type of loss that is difficult to untangle sometimes can be ambiguous loss. And that's the loss of someone or something that might be physically present still, but is somehow psychologically lost or emotionally impacted in an adverse way. This type of loss looks a little bit like perhaps dementia in an aging family member, or the loss of health functioning over time. It often goes unnoticed by sometimes ourselves, and it more often goes unnoticed by the people around us and the larger collective. And that's made more difficult by the fact that there are a lack of traditional rituals around this type of loss. We don't have any funerals to attend or any religious traditions around family member who's experiencing dementia. So there's a lack of closure process. And oftentimes there's a lack of physical evidence for the loss. It's hard to bring forward proof, quote unquote proof of the loss if that someone or something is still there. So this can be a really complex type of loss. The second type of event or events I'd like to talk about today is collective traumas. So some traumas are experienced as individuals and as a group. These are things like natural disasters, mass violence, war, an ongoing pandemic. And everyone experiences these things really, really differently based on our background, our coping styles, things that stress us, and where we were before the event and the changes that happened because of the event. So for families who perhaps have an individual in their system with complex health needs or for individuals themselves with complex health needs, this pandemic can feel doubly burdensome with things like the move to telehealth appointments or the need for ongoing in-person appointments that might feel more stressful than usual. It might mean a decrease in social supports, a lack of access to ongoing self-care routines. So there are a number of ways that a collective trauma can mean lots of different types of physical loss or ambiguous loss. So now that we've talked a little bit about events around that are traumatic for individuals, I'd like to talk about the second E that SAMHSA lays out, and that's how we experience an event. So the defining feature of a traumatic event is that the person experiences it as either emotionally harmful or life-threatening. Can be both, but it's important to note that it does not have to be life-threatening to be considered traumatic. Simply having emotional harm as the result of the event qualifies an event and experience as being traumatic. And we all live such different lives that it's easy to imagine how an event can feel one way for one person and another way for another person. And so these experiences really vary quite a lot. Lastly, we have the effect or effects of trauma. And so what we typically see in the aftermath of a traumatic event is that people's mental, physical, social, emotional well-beings are diminished. And oftentimes their spiritual well-being is diminished. And I'd like to pause here and just note that in the research and in clinical practice, the most common definition of spirituality is that sense of awe or connection to something larger than ourselves. And so that looks like different things for different people. For some people, it's being outside in nature. For other people, it's consulting with their religious leaders. For other people, it means prayer. So I'd like to just be really clear about that spirituality in itself is a really varied experience. But back to trauma, the hallmark of trauma is that there's an overall decrease in functioning across many different domains. And so one specific event that I'd like to talk about is grief, or effect that I'd like to talk about is grief. And just like loss, a person can grieve varied things, like a physical loss, like death, or the loss of health, the loss of expectations. Just like loss, grief looks really different for everyone, and it can happen in a time-limited acute period, or it can span a lifetime, which is more common in my experience, popping up around birthdays, anniversaries of deaths, anticipated milestones. And I like this quote. I think it sums it up quite nicely, that loss does not just signify the loss of a person or ability, pet, health, etc. It's not just about that individual no longer being there, but it's also about the lost moments, hopes, and plans. I'd like to pause also to consider the effects of trauma, loss, grief on the family system, because again, everyone experiences things so differently, generally speaking, and in relationship to one single thing. So for some person in the family, if there's a death, it might have been the death of their husband, but for someone else, it's the death of their father. In another circumstance, it might be that someone loses a son and another person loses a brother. And so it seems like a really simple thing to consider, but oftentimes when we're in the midst of processing loss and traumatic events and processing our grief, it can be really easy to forget that everyone has a different relationship to the loss, and everyone has different coping skills, different backgrounds. And so everyone's experience in loss and grief is going to look so different. Again, seems very elementary, but it really can help ground a family as they move through the grieving process together. And just like there are some adverse effects or impacts of trauma on individuals and systems, I'd like to raise the possibility that there is at least a potential for positive impact of the traumatic event on individuals and families. In the research, we call this post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth describes the way that individuals, quote, transform in new ways that go beyond his or her pre-trauma level of psychological functioning. In other words, we grow as a result of this difficult event. We change in a positive way as a result of this difficult event. So research and clinical practice show us that survivors of traumatic events can experience positive changes following the event, not just negative changes. And that includes things like an increased sense of personal strength, increased relational intimacy or support, an increased sense of spirituality, and an increased appreciation of life and all of its possibilities. And I think that it's really important to at least hold space for the possibility of this kind of positive change following a traumatic event. Post-traumatic growth does not in any way dismiss the adverse impacts of trauma. It doesn't erase the loss. It doesn't erase the pain. But I think it can be true that hardship and trauma can coexist with growth and positive change. I think both can be true at the same time. And post-traumatic growth happens every day in small moments and in broad strokes over the years. To that end, I'd like to talk a little bit about day-to-day coping and resilience. So one of the first tools that I think is really important in coping day-to-day after a traumatic event is to know your stressors. So typically a traumatic event will have some linked triggers to it. And I know that this word trigger can trigger a lot of people. It carries a little bit of baggage in our society right now, with everyone feeling different ways about that word. So again, I would encourage you, like we talked about at the beginning, to use whatever word feels comfortable to you, whether that's stressors or some other term. I think it's still important to acknowledge that they exist, though, these things that cause us to move from calm to stressed. And so whether the traumatic event was 20 years ago or it's still going on today, it's important to know what brings up those feelings of extreme stress, anxiety, sadness, anger, frustration, all of those typically unpleasant feelings. So even if you haven't experienced a trauma, we all have things that prompt us to move into those escalated states. It's helpful, I think, to take a moment to take stock of what you know causes you to move from calm to stress, regardless of any trauma background you might have. And that's because it's important to know the root of the problem before we get to solving the problem. And so it seems likely to me that if you're a parent or a caregiver of any kind, that you know exactly what causes your children or the people you care for to move from calm to stress. I would encourage you to get to know yourself this way, which sounds maybe a little bit silly to some people's ears, but I think that if we can cultivate that sense of gentle understanding with ourselves, the way that we do with the people that we care for, it might help us move forward in the coping process. The next thing that I think is really helpful in putting in our toolbox is learning to name our feelings, which again sounds very, very elementary, and so I hope you'll bear with me. But research tells us that just naming our mood can lessen how intensely we feel that feeling, which is really helpful when we're talking about unpleasant feelings like anxiety or fear or anger. Not that these feelings don't have a role, but that sense of ongoing high levels of those feelings can be really tiresome. And so lessening that feeling of intensity of that feeling can really be an important tool in coping day to day. And try not to judge yourself for feeling anything. I think we have a propensity to judge ourselves for feeling maybe angry as a result of a tragic event like a loss, or shame around another type of traumatic event. There are a lot of feelings that come up, and I would really encourage you to just try to label it and do nothing more. No judgment. And in those acute moments, no exploration, no digging of why it's coming up. Just label it, accept it, and hopefully that might help decrease that sense of overwhelm. And I really like this feeling wheel. Again, seems a little bit elementary, but there are some basic feelings in the middle there. So things like fearful. We'll take fearful as an example. Are you feeling perhaps more scared or anxious? And if you're feeling anxious, are you feeling more overwhelmed or worried? Maybe not necessary for you and how you want to start getting to know your feelings, but I think it can be helpful to drill down a little bit into the specifics of how you're feeling. And again, back to feelings. I think it can be really, really helpful to sit with that feeling and really learn how it shows up in your body. Just really, really listen to yourself. See if that sadness comes in this tight, constricted way in your chest or in a diffuse, heavy state throughout your body. And it might be helpful in helping you figure out how to move past that feeling, how to move through it, and how to move to a state of calm. In that regard, I think grounding techniques can be really, really helpful in getting us back to the present moment when we're starting to get escalated. So there are a few different things that we can do. I think that it's really, really helpful to take advantage of our natural propensity towards sensory experiences, because we're all kind of sensory creatures. Some of us seek more input than others. Some of us avoid more input than others, but we all have things in our sensory experience that we really like. And so I think it's really helpful to take advantage of this part of our humanity and bring ourselves back to the present moment by way of sensory experiences. So as you're escalating, naming 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, whether it's the clothes on your body or the breeze blowing on you, naming 3 things you can hear right now, maybe the traffic going by faintly in the background. My personal sounds right now are some seagulls in the distance, which is new to me since I come from the desert but now live by the ocean. So that's a really easy thing for me to pick out. Some of these sensory things fade into the background over time, but really try to see if you can bring yourself back to the moment. Again, you can name 2 things you can smell right now, and then 1 thing that you can taste, or if you're not in a position where you're tasting anything or can taste anything, like chocolate, which is really helpful, you can name 1 good thing about yourself, 1 thing that will keep you going. So that's one way of grounding ourselves in our senses. Another way of using our senses is just kind of moving that energy out. So whether that means dancing, singing, screaming, crying, going for a run, all of these things can be really helpful in moving us from perhaps a really anxious state or a really frustrated state, and just diffusing that tension and getting yourself back to a more regulated state. And if you can get yourself back to that regulated state, I think that it's important to acknowledge that we have so many thoughts in any given day. Some of the research tells us that we have tens of thousands, upwards of 50,000, 60,000 thoughts in any given day. And those are little thoughts like time to get up. It's little thoughts like, what am I going to have for breakfast? Or they're big thoughts like the self-talk that we have about how we're coping that day, if the day's going poorly, if the day's going well. There are, again, thousands of thoughts, and I think it's really important to try to not attach ourselves to some of these thoughts more than others, which is what we do when we work ourselves into a state of anxiety or stress, fear, sadness. So you can't hold a cloud, and really you can't hold a thought any more than you can hold a cloud. They're both transient things. Neither of them have a real form or mass. And especially with thoughts, there's no reason to think that one thought is more true than another thought. So if you can picture them, or at least hold the metaphor for them as clouds, it can become a little bit easier to let them pass through your mind without grabbing onto them and holding onto them, clasping onto them, and making yourself feel worse because of them. So that's my personal favorite trick for, I find it works best with anxious thoughts, but I think it can also work well with feelings of sadness, feelings of grief, letting them stay as long as they want and just move on. Another thing that can be really, really helpful when we're learning how to cope day to day is peer support. Because research shows that getting support from peers can create a space that's specifically designed for sharing feelings. I think a lot of our spaces that we live in day to day aren't specifically designed for sharing feelings, but these peer support type relationships are really meant for that. It also creates a way to share helpful information. Some tragic events have lingering consequences and impacts over time, and to connect with other people who have walked that path before you can be really, really helpful in a practical way. But it can also be really helpful in a way that helps you identify that they were once where you are, and they've since moved to maybe a more integrated place in how they're processing their loss. And so that allows for some hope, some feelings of empowerment that you can do it too, and really creates a space for growth. I'd like to close out our discussion about coping day to day with this quote by known Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl. It says, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom." So I think it's really important to acknowledge that we have many opportunities to choose our response throughout the day. And like anything else that we do in our whole lives, we are not going to nail it 100% of the time, at least to our expectations. So I think that can be a really frustrating thought that we're not going to get it right all the time, but it can also be a really freeing thought that we have all of these opportunities laid out in front of us every day generally, but also as it relates to trauma, to really learn how to cope in a way that works for us. So having talked a little bit about that day-to-day coping around the acutely stressful period of following a traumatic event, I'd like to talk a little bit about long-term healing and resilience. So the nature of a traumatic event is that it can force us into the state of myopia, where we focus a lot on that traumatic event. And that is 100% understandable, because that's how our bodies are designed, right? We are created to focus on the things that threaten us, that make us uncomfortable, so that we can address those things. The problem is that some of these events linger, right? Like we talked about, grief can happen over the course of a lifetime, or impacts of traumatic events can linger throughout one's lifetime. But I think that the period that follows a traumatic event really allows us to come back out of survival mode and focus on things other than that event. And one of the things that's really helpful to focus on after a traumatic event is gratitude, because research tells us that focusing on gratitude increases our happiness and offers a wide variety of physical, psychological, and emotional benefits. I myself, several years ago, experienced a health crisis that was incredibly frightening. There were a number of weeks where no one knew what was going on with me, and things were getting worse rather quickly, and things that had never happened to me before were happening to me. Things got really acute, and I was scared for my life. And so it was really hard for me during that time to focus on things that were going well. But in the period of time afterwards, it became really easy to identify who showed up for me in support, being able to recognize how I myself was coping with things, and really honoring that. And it also, over time, became clear to me that not only were some things good before and during the event that were good before, but things became good as a result of that traumatic event. And I think that's a really important thing to think about, that even in hardship, we can have an open mind about the good things that are still present despite the trauma, but we can also focus on what's good because of the trauma. And so for me, that meant that in the weeks and months that followed, I was able to focus on cultivating a lifestyle and a diet that worked for me and my body and supported me specifically, which is not something I was doing before. So as a result, I'm healthier now than I ever was before, although I do have to consider this event that happened in my life because it has ongoing effects for me. But nonetheless, something good came of it. And so it can be helpful to keep a daily journal, maybe, or just a physical running list of these things that we're grateful for. I like to do mine at dinner time and name 3 things that I'm grateful for that day. And sometimes it's clear that I'm going through a little bit of a stressful phase because I'm grateful for the basics, right? Chocolate, bed to sleep in, food on the table. And other times it's clear that there are a lot of really wonderful things happening in my life. So I'm grateful for increased connections with other people, a fulfilling job, things like that. And so you can also start to learn a little bit about yourself through this process, which I think is really interesting. And for some people, this daily processing of what you're grateful for isn't really sustainable, and it can just feel like another thing on the to-do list. But I think it, at the very least, is helpful to keep some sort of mental or physical list about the things that you're grateful for, so that when you go through a stressful event, it's really accessible to you, and you can clearly identify for yourself what is going good in your life, what continues to be good, and what might be good as a result of the traumatic event. I'd also like to talk about self-care, and I'd like to be really, really careful in how I talk about self-care, because I think it's taken on a life of its own in our culture today. I think that sometimes it can feel like another thing to put on the to-do list, which can be stressful. And I think that there's also some sort of feeling around it that if you can just take care of yourself enough, if you can just do enough self-care, do enough skincare routine, take enough bubble baths, you'll be fine. You'll have fixed it, and it's up to you. I think it perhaps irresponsibly puts the onus on us only to take care of ourselves, But I do think it's worth cultivating that practice of caring for ourselves, because if we're not caring for ourselves, there's no guarantee that others will. Hopefully you have people in your life who will take care of you, but at the end of the day, it's just you. And so I do think it's an important thing to cultivate without putting a lot of stress and a lot of responsibility on that one thing in your life. But in any case, I digress. I think it's also really important, as we're talking about self-care, to remember that it's not just about the superficial maybe things, or the surface level things, I guess is a better word for it, because those feel nice. It feels nice to take a bubble bath. It feels good to eat a bar of chocolate. But what helps us create a long-term picture of health and healing are three things. Maintenance of healthy behaviors, and for everyone that looks a little bit differently. Sometimes it's diet, sleep, exercise. Those are the main things that really matter for everyone, but those three things look really different for everyone. Another really important pillar of self-care is having some recreational outlet or means of positive self-expression. And this looks really, really different for everyone. Sometimes it means cooking a nice meal for ourselves and for other people. Sometimes it means painting, dancing, outdoor activities, things like that. And lastly, again, in the research, I'd like to be really clear that spirituality has a pretty broad definition, but the last pillar of effective self-care is spiritually focused activities. For some people, this means meditation. For other people, it means volunteering. For other people, it means going to church or having a personal prayer practice. But it is, by the research, an important pillar of self-care. And so finding that thing that makes you feel that sense of connection to something larger than yourself can be a really important part of taking care of yourself. The most important part, though, of all of this is that it should all be based in self-compassion, because self-care without self-compassion you're not doing yourself any favors. So what do we mean by self-compassion? Self-compassion is a construct from Buddhist thought, and its main features are being kind to ourselves, having a sense of common humanity, and practicing mindfulness as much as we're able to. But what I'd really like to highlight is that it's characterized by being gentle with ourselves when faced with a perceived sense of inadequacy or failure. And so what does this mean in practice? It means moving away from the shoulds and moving away from that New Year's Eve type resolution language, because that can cause additional stress that we just don't need. Moving away from avoidant or disconnected coping is also really, really important in self-compassionate self-care. And this is not to say that avoidant or disconnected coping does not have its place, because it absolutely does. When we are acutely experiencing stress or going through a traumatic event, these things are self-protective. And so I don't want you to feel any shame or have any judgment around yourself, around any avoidant or disconnected coping that you've done or are doing, because we all have these in ourselves. It's there for a reason. It's meant to protect us. But as we move forward in our healing journey, the more we can move away from avoidant coping and disconnected coping and towards connected coping, it's really going to help us in our healing journey. And you're likely going to be healthier and happier as a result. And the last thing that it looks like in practice, and I really want to emphasize this, is just being kind to ourselves to heal ourselves. Give yourself permission to not solve the unsolvable problems, to not leave every ounce of pain behind, and to not do everything right. That's a really important part of taking care of ourselves that I think a lot of us miss as we're going through the checklist and the activities of the things that feel like self-care. But again, if it's not rooted in self-compassion, you're not doing yourself any favors. Some people like to create a self-care plan. You can find all kinds of templates online. I kind of like this one. I would probably modify it a little bit, maybe in that box to the right, instead of I want to accomplish, or maybe in addition to I want to accomplish, I might create a list of things I have accomplished. I think that reframing things as they feel right for you is important when you're coming up with a self-care plan. And for some people, it doesn't really make much of a difference to write things down. I would encourage you to at least try it and see how it feels to you. But for some people, it's not a thing that really helps them maintain ongoing healing. But I think it's worth at least considering mentally what your self-care plan looks like. And when you do any kind of self-care planning, whether it's writing things down or planning it out mentally or talking it out with a partner, it can be nice to ground it in this question. How do you reassure yourself? Because when you think about it, what we're doing when we're trying to help children self-soothe or help a friend really start to self-regulate, what we're really trying to do is we're reassuring them. We're reassuring them that they're enough, that they have what it takes to overcome this obstacle, and that you're going to be there with them to do it. We're reassuring them that everything is going to be okay. And so in this vein of treating ourselves the way that we treat the people we care for, I'd like for you to consider how you reassure yourself. What unique things help you know that you're going to be okay? And that can be the basis of finding a really helpful self-plan for yourself. Another thing that's really helpful for long-term healing, we talked about peer support earlier. Excuse me, sorry. A little tickle in my throat. So we talked about peer support earlier, and that can be really, really helpful in that acutely stressful post-trauma phase. But it can also be really, really helpful for long-term healing. So you're here, you already have a sense of how to get yourself connected, but quick little plug for Hope for HIE. If you go to their Connect tab, they have all kinds of other ways to connect, like through retreats or local groups to meet other families. And this is perhaps one chapter of your story, one facet of your life. And so I'd encourage you to go out and get connected to other groups, other people that share your values and interests. And that can really, even if it has nothing to do with the trauma, it has nothing to do with the traumatic event or your experience of it, just getting connected to other people like you can really create a sense of healing community, even if it's going to maybe an art class at a community art center or joining a local basketball league with other adults. All of these things can really help foster connection, which is in and of itself very healing. And if these things aren't doing the trick for you and they aren't consistently helping you feel well, I think it can be really important to consider getting a professional on board. So if you want to find a counselor or a therapist, it can sometimes feel like a difficult thing emotionally and logistically to find a counselor, but it can be as easy as calling the number or going on the website on the back of your insurance card. There are also sites like psychologytoday.com that can really help you narrow down what exactly you're looking for geographically, in regards to their training background, things like that. It can really help you narrow down who the right person might be to help you. But I'd also encourage you to try asking around a little bit if you're comfortable with that. If you know that one of your close friends sees a therapist, there's a strong likelihood that given your similarities maybe with people in your life, that same therapist might be helpful for you. So that can be a really effective way of finding someone. So when you're looking for a therapist, remember that it's okay and it's encouraged to ask them if they can help you achieve your goals and meet your needs, because everyone has really different backgrounds when it comes to trauma or when it comes to therapy. Everyone has different credentials. Some people have focused primarily on training themselves on how to help people with trauma. Other people focus more on counseling within partnerships, within marriages and couples. Other people really focus on family therapy. It runs the gamut. So don't feel embarrassed. Don't feel ashamed about asking someone what their background is and if they can help you, and really be serious about that question. Also, don't be afraid to try several therapists. Again, everyone's really, really different, not only in training and credentialing, but in their personality. And so much of the therapeutic gains that you might make in therapy are because of the therapeutic relationship. Because otherwise, you could probably just go on Amazon and get yourself a self-help book, which is more than enough for some people and can also be a nice complement to therapy. But point being, that relationship is what you're seeking out when you're finding a therapist. They're not just some carrier of information that they're going to download into you. It's about that back and forth. And so finding a good fit with a therapist is really important. So don't be afraid about going to one, and if it's not a fit, going to another. No one's feelings will be hurt. We all understand that this is how the process works. I can assure you of that. Lastly, as I referenced a little bit a few seconds ago, making the call can sometimes feel like the hardest part, logistically, but more so emotionally, because you're committing to talking to someone about those hard things that you've experienced. And so I just want to encourage you to do your best if you need this resource, if you feel like you need this resource, to just punch in those numbers, make an appointment, and take that plunge, because that's usually one of the hardest parts. And so if you are looking for some professional support, but you need it urgently, I would encourage you to call a crisis hotline. This National Suicide Prevention Hotline is a really good start, even if perhaps you're not feeling exactly precisely suicidal, but you are feeling really, really escalated and you feel like you need some intermediate care between maybe a first appointment with a therapist and where you are right now. Calling a hotline can be a really helpful way to get yourself some emotional support, but also they're really good at plugging you into resources that will meet your needs in that moment. You'd also, it might also be helpful to look into local hotlines. A lot of cities and counties run their own local hotlines. And so those hotlines are really, really connected with the local services in the community. And they can also be a little bit closer to understanding what wait lists look like in one program or what might be a good fit for you specifically in another program. So those hotlines can be really, really helpful. And if you're feeling like you need more help, but you don't need it urgently per se, warm lines and helplines can be really helpful. So I've put three here. There's the Postpartum Support International one. And that one is specifically designed for that postpartum period of about a year after a delivery. They have services for mothers, they have services for partners, and they have really specific groups that they can connect you with. But they're also really good at, again, getting you connected to those resources in your area that might be a good fit for you and that might take your insurance. The SAMHSA Treatment Referral Helpline is another really great clearinghouse for that. So is the National Alliance of Mental Illness Helpline. And all of these, as you might be able to tell by the name warm line or helpline, they don't run 24/7, but if you don't need urgent attention, it can be a really helpful place to go to. You can leave a message and they'll call you back with, again, some emotional support and also some resources in your area that might be a good fit for you. So I hope that today I've been able to provide some clarity about how much broader this term trauma has become and how inclusive it is of many different life events. I hope that I've been able to offer some practical thoughts on coping and long-term healing. What I'd like to leave you with is that your future will inherently be informed by the trauma or hardships that you've experienced. And for that, I have a lot of empathy for that. I hope you know that you're not alone. It seems likely that you might experience that feeling of connection already by virtue of being here in this group with Hope for HIE. But I think it's also important to really talk about the post-traumatic growth that you've experienced as a result of an event. Your future will also be informed by that. And making meaning out of an experience can be as simple as journaling or talking to someone about your experience like you might already be doing. It can be as complex as engaging in activism for a cause that's meaningful to you or doing something in memory of a loved one. Again, quick plug for Hope for HIE. You can go to that Connect tab, and under that tab, there's another tab called Get Involved, and they can help you figure out how to use your voice on this specific area in speaking with legislators or educational institutions, things like that. Because like we talked about at the beginning, these narratives that shape our lives, they can be really, really powerful in a lot of different ways. And using your voice can really, really help other people. And it seems likely to me that it might also be healing for you in that process. I'd like to stress that you should not feel any pressure to do anything at all in particular around making meaning after a traumatic event. Simply doing what you're doing is already enough. If you're doing the things that feel right to you, you're doing it. You're doing the work. And so I don't want anyone to feel any pressure to go out and start any foundations or, lobby Congress, anything like that. If you want to do that, that's wonderful. But if that's not what your journey is, then please don't feel any sort of pressure to do any more than what you're doing, because what you're doing is enough. I'd like to leave you with this quote, this Buddhist proverb that says, "Pain is inevitable and suffering is optional." And I think that sums up the experience of trauma really well, because we don't have any control over what life throws at us, whether it's health events, deaths, pandemics. We don't get any say in that. But we are the highest expert on ourselves, and we play the most active role in managing our own suffering. And I think that that can be a really empowering thing to carry forward with you in life. And to that end, if there's anything at Hope for HIE that we can do for you to lessen your suffering, any tools that we can give you, any resources we can connect you with, or just to listen ear, please let us know. And we are happy to do that because we know that this journey is complex and it's winding. And sometimes you feel like you've made some progress and then things set you back. They're as varied as our experiences are in the sense of trauma, our experiences are just as varied when we're talking about healing. So if there's anything that we can do to support you, please let us know. And if there's anything that you had questions about, thoughts, comments about today that you want us to hear, please, again, let us know. Thank you for taking the time to talk today, to listen. And again, please reach out if there's anything at all that we can do.